some cases, redundant offices. Pensions still remains a big thing. It's in the sector risk profile. Stock condition, probably towards the top of the list, this really, not least because the regulator has said many times, including recently to us in the discussion, that stock condition and the relative investment assumptions relative to the decent homes standard, there's still a gap there that they see that they're very concerned about, compounded by a concern about quality of data in relation to stock condition and keeping on top of that. It's a big challenge for executives and the board to really understand spend versus projections in relation to that. And again, in relation to that, decarbonisation is obviously a massive sort of potential impact on the business plan, which is then forcing people to make choices about what they spend their limited resources on. And I suppose just ending on that, funding, obviously you've got massive portfolios throughout the sector, and making sure that your funding assumptions and making sure you've got access to funding is crucial. So there's lots of challenges in that as ever, but probably in a more dynamic environment that we've seen for a long time, really.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. I mean, you've drifted in there to kind of the next question, which clearly some of those topics you then start to appear on risk schedules and development of risk appetite around those kind of things. I know one of the questions that we ask when we do away day sessions with boards on risk is around top 5 risks that organisations really want to focus on to help people prioritise. What are we seeing in terms of those kind of top 5 risks, and is there anything that's particularly jumped up the risk ladder, if you want, because of the current operating environment?
Yeah, it's interesting. I do a lot of work on risk, including this week. I've done a few sessions, and that sort of top 5, top 10, it does change from business to business, depending on the type of business that a housing association is involved in. Some people are doing more development than others. Some people are doing for sale. Some people do more care. Some people don't do care at all. So it does differ, but there are some common themes, much of which overlap with the sector risk profile. You know, there's obviously commonality there. Health and safety is in there, obviously building safety particularly. Reputational risk is looming again, unfortunately, with the recent very sad news that's been in the press and front page news for a while. Very difficult, as unfortunately, even though pockets of the sector can struggle sometimes with reputation, it does tend to taint the whole sector, particularly, you know, in the minds of politicians, local and national. Where people are doing sales, that's also a key risk. Obviously, the market is starting to turn now. We're seeing that in certain parts of the country, particularly in the southeast. Development, delivery, contractor viability, I've mentioned that already. A big thing also in the minds of the regulator, but also obviously with clients as well, is data quality, the data integrity. That you know, are you using the data you've got effectively? Not just stock condition, but all the sort of data, which we collect loads of data. Are we using it effectively? And of course, on the similar sort of theme, the protection of data and the threat of cyber risk. And we know, unfortunately, a number of our clients have had some quite serious ransom attacks. Having said that, the sector is brilliant at sharing, and where people have had a bit of an issue, they've been happy to share solutions with those that are just starting out with a serious problem like that. Another area that is always on risk registers, I see anyway, is counterparty risk. So where people have got arrangements with stakeholders, maybe contractors or joint ventures, anywhere where you're not fully in control of the relationship, making sure that you understand those risks and that you mitigate them as far as you can, really. Rent compliance is something that we've been involved in a lot. Sarah does a lot of work in this area, and our financial colleagues get involved in that. It's really quite a complex area, always has been, and is increasingly. We've seen people having to self-refer due to problems being found in rent setting, historical rent setting, some of it driven by data quality, but also some due to churn of staff. losing that sort of business intelligence, which is so crucial in such a complex area. People with supported housing, massive potential exposures there. They always figure in risk registers, as do all the financial matters like treasury, funding, pensions, and the decarbonisation challenge, which is obviously a massive challenge because we're not quite sure what the solutions are yet, or the costs.
And against that backdrop of an increasingly long list of risks and that much more volatility, are we seeing clients doing different things to embed their risk management, or than they might have done previously?
Yeah. Increasingly, we're finding people taking a fresh look at risk in its wider sense, really. A lot of people now going back to risk appetite statements and just trying to work out whether it's up to date, and also whether it's really a useful tool. Some people have literally a statement, and people these days, we're seeing them develop more sophisticated documents that show the risk that they are setting an appetite against, and not just setting a judgment, so averse or hungry or balanced or whatever, but actually putting a supporting narrative to that, along with protocols for use. Because obviously risk appetite it's not a straitjacket. It's a default position unless you've got strong argument from moving away from that. So we're finding people developing that in more detail, so that people who are not party to the judgment, i.e. staff who might be preparing reports to boards, can understand the context. Why is the risk appetite that? So there's quite a bit of that going on. A lot of people also reviewing risk registers and the format for that to make them live documents, not just a static report. They're including things like target risks, which are starting to emerge now as a key feature in risk registers, and how that relates to the risk appetite. But clearly the target risk, if you can set that, means it drives action. So if you're not at target and you want to have that target, it drives action. So it's not a static report. So it improves that sort of live ability of the risk register to be a real genuine tool. So yeah, quite a bit going on in the area of risk, I would say, Paul.
Yeah, great, Andy. I'm going to jump, just because I'm obviously keeping the eye on the time as well as we go through here. But I'm just going to jump to a specific question because it's actually already kind of come up a bit in the Q&A, I see. But have you got a feel for where the lending markets are at the moment and how they're regarding organisations and their appetite? And
yeah, I mean, the wider market means we've seen interest rates rising fairly steadily recently, partly due to the impact of the war in the Ukraine. We've also had the impact of the mini budget. To be honest, at the moment, we're seeing banks still expressing an appetite for the sector, but there is some evidence that of a sort of a little bit more selectivity there, and pitching for funding requires a little bit more detail than was previously required. And always that's been quite a detailed engagement anyway. But so it does remain to be seen how things will pan out going forward. But as we now seem to be reaching a peak of inflation, that is the hope anyway, although some of this is beyond the scope of boundaries of the UK. That could enable base rates to actually start to come down a bit in the sort of short to medium term.
Okay, great, Andy. Thanks very much. I'm sure might come back to you in the Q&A. I think there are some kind of questions whizzing in around that. But thank you for that. Thanks very much, Rebecca. Can I kind of come to you now about talking again, not exclusively, but from a financial aspect, and just want to go back to your point about poverty, really, because I think it was really powerful, your answer to the first question. I mean, how do you think that is affecting Maryhill, and what actions are you taking around addressing it, responding to it?
Sure. I mean, just to give people a bit of context, at Maryhill, we've got just over 3,000 properties. We work very much in a community-based association in the Maryhill and Roskell areas of northwest Glasgow, areas that traditionally are high, you know, kind of high on the deprivation indexes, if you like. So poverty is a long-term issue here. However, what I would say is that this year, the referrals, we operate a range of wider role services, including financial support, energy advice. The energy advice referrals have gone through the roof this year, and there's a lot of need for those wider role services. We've also got housing officers increasingly finding that when they visit customers, they're now living in one room of their home because that's they're only heating one room of their home. Now that's bad for customers' health. It's also bad for our stock health in terms of condensation, mold, etc. So it's very much about our customers, but it's also about our stock. We need to think about how poverty impacts on our stock. We started talking to customers about cost of living and how we could help them long before the rent freeze announcement was made. Basically, since we set the business plan last March, with inflation climbing, it's been an ongoing conversation, an ongoing revisit of the business plan thinking since then. We have put an additional £30,000 into our community support fund. That's for this year. That will help people through the winter. We're putting an additional 50,000 into our Maryhill Helps Fund for next financial year and the one after. So that probably gives you a sense that, yes, it is very much about, we are having to cut our cloth, but we're not cutting these kind of services that are actually about supporting customers. We think that the need is that we put more in. So that's what we're doing, Paul.
Yeah, no, I mean, it does sound like you're taking some really significant actions there, Rebecca. I mean, that's clearly going to come with challenges for you as an organisation, and I just wonder how your board are responding to that. How's your board engaging with the challenges that you're facing as an organisation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and you probably expect this as an FD, what I would say is that that robust business planning really has to be at the core of this. We are very much about supporting our customers, but it has to be backed by a robust, viable business plan in the long term. And that is always a careful balancing act, but even more so. So we have basically, we knew that we were going to have to recast the business plan anyway. We decided that back in March, recast it at half-year point, and that was really about recognising the impact of inflation on the organisation, because, you know, headline inflation rate is one thing, but actually what's the real inflation on the costs in your business, and really understanding those costs to you. So, for example, Maryhill reactive repairs costs for us went up by 26%. Now that won't be the same for everyone, but for us, because we had to come out of contract and go into contract, that coming out of contract, I believe, was really about inflation anyway. The company delivering that, removing themselves, had to go back out to market. So that's a real big cost. Similar, our void repairs costs went up by 19%. Now, just those two inflationary impacts would need a rent increase of 3% just to cover those. So that was the kind of opening statement, if you like. We got a revised base case business plan. We then said, right, well, okay, our business plan assumption is always we put rents up by CPI. What would that look like? And that gave us a base plan to measure against. But the board knew, I mean, the board is not going to put rents up by 11%. We're not going to do that, but it is about recognising the impact in the business of any below CPI rent increase that we might do. So we went out and talked to customers and asked them about how we should save money. We set out how much money a rent freeze, because that's what the government started talking about, a rent freeze, how much that would strip out of the business, and then a whole range of different rent scenarios. What we decided very early on, as I've already mentioned, we are not going to cut back on our non-core services. In fact, we need to put more money in there, and we need to make sure that that's prioritised. What we then looked at was our investment. Most of our mitigating action is about delaying our investment programme, but we prioritise. So, for example, wind and watertight, health and safety, those cannot stop. So we have a whole range of different stock types, from high-rise multi-stories that need render replaced, Victorian sandstone tenements that need an ongoing stonework programme. Those things can't stop. So regardless, even if we are rent freeze, those things can't stop. We need to have that. We then looked at a range of energy efficiency measures. So we're committed to replacing people's old electric storage heaters, because they're really expensive. It's about addressing fuel poverty and making sure our homes are warm. So we will be continuing with our bringing in more carbon efficient, doing a bit for net zero as well, in terms of replacing our old electric systems. Then the next priority level down was other energy efficiency, like window replacement programmes, boiler replacement, again thinking about the difference it makes for customers in the homes that they live in. That is getting harder on the lower rent increase. It's getting harder. Once you get to priority 3, we're starting to have to really cut that. The next priority was stuff we promised that we would do. You'll not be surprised, a lot of the stuff we promised we'd do isn't going to happen with a low rent increase. And then the final one was, we called it everything else, which is basically your kitchen and kitchens and bathroom replacements. We won't do any over the next 5 years because, quite frankly, it doesn't actually make that huge of a difference. The social value return that you get from kitchens and bathrooms isn't huge. We'd rather give people more heating, cut the drafts from their windows, and just have to wait for kitchens and bathrooms. The other factor that we did have to bring in was looking at above CPI rent increases in future years. Now, we'd really see that as a retrograde step. We've worked really hard to have CPI only inflation rates, but we do have to balance the books. And we did explain and discuss with customers that the lower the rent increase is that's imposed on us in the coming year, the more likely it is that we will have to put rents up by more than CPI in future. So quite a lot then. Sorry, Paul, yes. We did quite a lot.
That's great, Rebecca. I mean, I'm going to jump ahead if I come to the questions for you here, but because I think what you've just touched on, I know having worked with you over a period of years, and DTP having worked with you, that you are rigorously committed to the golden rules that you have as an organisation, and I know you do a lot of work in terms of embedding that with your board. Yeah. How have you been able to test that out in terms of the kind of volatility that we're talking about here, and the work have you done with your board around that?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically there was a whole range of scenarios that we tested. I do work with the board. We do kind of regular kind of workshop sessions about business planning, about golden rules, what they mean, why they're important, and then provide them with a RAG rated table so they can see the impact, where we're getting close to our golden rule, where we're breaching it, and they understand that. So I think what's quite telling is that the board asked me in August to go away and test the 3, 5 and 7, which was what you guys down in England where the consultation was on, and the board ruled out 3%. So we are actively consulting with our customers right now on 5, 7 and 9. 3% does not generate a viable business plan unless we put rents up by CPI +1 for the entire rest of the model. And that isn't something the board was comfortable with. So I said, well, if you don't do the CPI +1, you breach your golden rules. And they went, well, we're not doing that. That's not good. It's not good governance as well as not good finance sense. So yeah, I would say that the golden rules for us, it's not a kind of theoretical thing that the Audit and Risk Committee talk about. It's embedded in that kind of risk management for our board, that they really understand that it's there as both an early warning sign, and also it gives a bit of a safety net for things that might go wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rebecca. I think we're all increasingly finding that some of those things that we've had in our practice around risk management and around scenario planning and things like golden rules are increasingly important in these kind of current times, and it's right now that those things are kind of coming into their own, and those measures that need to be as robust as ever. Rebecca, thanks very much for that. Again, we may well be coming back to you in the Q&A, but I'm going to move on now to, and there's clearly been the two issues of finance and governance are interrelated, and there's clearly been a crossover there to two. But I'm just going to go now with Sarah and Meg on a bit more on the governance side. And Sarah, you first of all, what governance challenges are we seeing the kind of current situation bringing across our range of clients?
Thank you, Paul. So I think my sort of starting point will really build on something that Andy talked about earlier, really, in terms of just stressing that boards really ensure that they're working with robust data and information, because, you know, having that robustness and using that to make really effective decisions, and then making sure equally that you've got an audit trail that kind of covers all of that. So, you know, we know that the regulator is really focusing on how boards understand the data, how they challenge that it's accurate, and just how they document, you know, how all of that sort of assurance has been provided to them. But I think, again, you know, I mentioned this earlier on, it really is difficult balancing all of the different priorities that and decisions that board need to make. But I think, you know, it also comes back down to balancing the regulatory responses with other key priorities, such as being a charity. So, you know, we work with lots of organisations who are charities, and, you know, they also need to make sure that they're balancing the decisions, considering the charitable objects and, you know, that key organisational purpose. And I think the other point, Megan touched on this earlier, is just how, you know, kind of having a really solid board in place is a challenge. So we know that recruitment this year in particular has been really challenging. You know, I think it's challenging to be a board member in social housing at this time, and I think that's making, you know, recruitment to positions even more challenging. But we're also seeing organisations struggling to recruit to some of those key governance roles, you know, so governance managers, company secretaries. And I think, you know, the reason behind that is that essentially within the sector, sort of drawing from quite a small pool of, you know, really experienced staff. So I think, you know, the events of the last sort of month have really, really heightened the importance of boards getting a grip of and understanding their position in relation to some of those sector topics, such as damp and mould, you know. And I think the key question is, how do we know that we don't have a problem? And, you know, very recently I've heard various boards asking that exact question to the executive. So what assurance do we have to make sure that we don't have those don't have those problems? Thinking about things like triangulating data. So as well as having all the different assurance mechanisms that you might have, are they all telling you the same thing? So what are your complaints saying? What do you know about complaints that are going through to the Housing Ombudsman? You know, what's that sort of local intelligence telling you as well? And I think finally, really, the sort of other key area is just got an agreed process in place to escalate if there are problems. So again, it just comes back to that, you know, making sure that you've got those measures in, that you can have those discussions, and you can make sure that there are effective communication mechanisms in place.
Yeah, thanks. A really comprehensive answer there. You touched on the question, you know, how difficult it is to being on a governing body of a housing organisation at the moment, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think people are kind of realising that, and board members are kind of seeking advice. But what kind of questions do you think boards should be asking right now, if you know, of their executives, of their organisations? What are the critical things?
So I'm going to go back to that early point again, and I don't want to labour it, but I think it almost needs labouring, really, in terms of how robust is the data we hold. So, essentially, when you think about that, it's, how robust is the data we have in our stock condition, around how we're meeting our requirements around health and safety. And, we know that it's a massive focus area for the regulator at the moment. So, how do we know that that data accurately reflects our stock, and that the systems that hold all that data are protecting its integrity? Lots of organisations have got lots of different systems that hold data, some of which might be similar. So how do we know that, as an example, data in asset management systems is similar to data in housing management systems? So again, comes back to that whole point around sort of triangulation. And I think data is, again, absolutely crucial in the work that we've been seeing around rent setting, because a lot of the challenges that providers are facing in relation to rent setting, when you look at the kind of, why has it happened, it tends to lead back to data. So making sure, again, that the organisations really understand their stock, and that feeds into all of those different elements.
And Sarah, just if you were, which I know you do from time to time, if we're giving advice to board members, almost just in terms of about, we want our boards to be resilient, and we want people to stay kind of committed to their organisations and stick with their organisations through this process. What advice would you give to a board member right now?
So I think there's two things. So first of all, and again, I think Megan touched on this, being really clear about your role and remit, and making sure that collectively that you're being consistent in your understanding of that. So in this current climate, it really is tempting for some board members to perhaps cross the line into that more managerial, operational aspect, rather than kind of keeping at the strategic end. I think, even if you need to do that in terms of a deep dive topic to give that additional level of assurance, just make sure you come back up to the surface and focus back in on that strategic governance. And I think the final point really would be just being calm and not overreacting if you've got a problem. Think carefully about perhaps the impact, the risks, the mitigations that you've got, and working with board colleagues and the executive, agreeing a plan for resolution, thinking about any notifications that might be needed, and key communications, because I think sometimes we also find that the sort of communication plan can get left behind when there's a real challenge to deal with. And finally, just making sure that you seek that professional advice where it's required.
Yeah, great. Sarah, thanks very much. Just a reminder, everybody, to all our kind of viewers as well, before I go to Megan, that the Q&A function is open on the Zoom thing here. So please don't hesitate to put questions to us. We probably will get a time to answer a couple at the end of this. So Megan, coming to you, you've been waiting amazingly patiently there while we've all been talking. How have you seen your board respond to the kind of challenges in recent months?
That's a really interesting question, and I think risk has been an increasing area of discussion at Leeds Federated. But I think there's a couple of things that I've heard recently, and it sort of reflects on, again, some of what Sarah said and what's come up. Kate Dodsworth at the Play Shapers conference a couple of weeks ago made a comment that the operational has got strategic as a result of reputation, and I think it's something that's absolutely hit home with me, and I'm sure it's something that's hit home with others. And this sort of blurring of how much information and how much assurance do board members want is something that sort of puts additional pressures on the exec team as well. And it's sort of just making sure we try to balance that. Our finance director as well, a couple of days ago, sent something through, and he referenced something he'd heard about boards needing to have more understanding of operational issues that have strategic implications. And he likened this to a way of deciding where to focus additional assurance. So again, coming back to what Sarah said, we've done things like deep dives where boards have kind of gone, this is a really important thing, but the deep dive then happens with our audit and risk committee, where you've got that sort of real detailed focus. And I think sometimes it's just how you manage that process internally. But I think that the administration of risk and the importance of risk has just massively changed at Leeds Fed over the last couple of years. And I think must have been about 2020, we've always had a risk paper within the board packs, but it changed from being at the end of the pack to being paper number one, probably as a result of Brexit and COVID and everything else that we were facing. But it's such an important paper that really sort of focuses the board at the start of the meeting on all of those external issues that we're facing, and helps just really sort of pinpoint what we want to be looking at. And I think going back to, again, other comments that have been made, the operating environment that we're in is just so uncertain. There's so much happening. And I think some of the things that we've seen are, in previous years where we might have had maybe one or two changes overall in the risk sort of register or levels risk scoring that we might have done, we may be seeing one or two changes that we want to make on a meeting by meeting basis. And I think papers that were sort of, or discussions that were maybe sort of 2 minutes became 5 minutes, have become 10 to 15 minutes. And I think the board have just really wanted to have that time to really explore and debate and understand the external environment and the impact that it's having on the organisation and our customers, to really understand what decisions we're making. I think that the main aspect of sort of things that's really sort of hit home to me more recently is the level of discomfort that the board members feel with some of the risk scores falling outside of the appetite. And there's been a lot of questions about, well, how do we respond to that? So that's kind of where we are with that one.
Okay. Are you doing things differently with your board now because of the kind of current environment that you might have done previously?
There are some things that we're doing differently, but I think, obviously governance hat on and all of that, I think it's also really important to make sure you have the fundamentals absolutely right. And one of the big pieces of work that we did, and I think that has just helped us really sort of position ourselves when the Code of Governance came out, was to do that action plan to kind of go, we meet this is how, we don't meet this, what are we doing to address it, and just make sure that there is that clarity amongst the board of sort of where we are and what we're doing. And I think we were in a good position, and it wasn't suddenly like we've got nothing. It was about building on what we'd got, but making sure that things that we now have in place that sort of are the building blocks for where the board sort of are looking for their reference points have got that clarity. But I think with regards to what we are doing differently, it comes back to the board relationships, which was one of the things I mentioned at the beginning. Excuse me, we had an away day that we ran, really focusing on relationships with the board, looking at strengths, weaknesses. We looked at our legacy, our history. We had time to tell stories about sort of all of our interactions with Leeds Fed, from being a customer, being a member of staff, being a board member, and also really interesting to hear from some of our new board members who were very aware of us within the sector and their interpretation of what they'd seen before obviously sort of hearing from everybody else. We also spent some time at that session looking at the different decision-making modes of boards to really understand how best they can be effective. So looking at where we're making fiduciary decisions, strategic and generative, and it just helped really sort of highlight and underpin how you want the board to be working, and it helped give them that background as well to look at how can we be the most effective in the limited time that we've got, to make sure that you sort of still making sure you're delivering the day-to-day business need, the strategy setting, the planning, but also that reflection, because I think that is such an important part, and having that level of challenge, because I do think that is a really important part of what you need on a board. You don't want everyone just to be sitting there and kind of going, yes, I totally agree with that. And in reality, someone's going, I don't, or I don't get it. And I think that's one of the things that we need to work through, and that's where relationships are so important. You need to have that confidence. And I think from that session, we're creating a set of guiding principles which will help new board members, but also current board members, really have clarity around their role, what the purpose is, and the behaviours expected from the outset. So I suppose summing up, ours is about board relationships. That's what we've been doing differently.
Sounds quite comprehensive, Megan. And I think that thing about understanding the history and values of an organisation is absolutely critical, particularly with new board members coming on. Just, you mentioned there about the kind of relationships and the difficulties around, as I say, it's challenging being a board member at the moment. And I just wonder about you doing more to make sure that, you know, there's this expectation that the board own the risks of the organisation and own the risk strategy? Are you doing anything particularly around that, given that those risks are so strong and so volatile at the moment?
Yes, and again, governance hat on, get the basics right, have your template, have your linked risks, make sure there's reference to your terms of reference, your code of governance, and just all those things that just sort of underpin some of the basics. But I think beyond that, there's a couple of things that we have done, I think, to just try and make sure that there's true ownership of risk amongst the board. And I caveat to say, when I say we, I don't mean we, I mean our finance director, Jason Ridley, who's led on these things. And again, going back to what Andy said earlier, the first thing that we did was a rewrite of our risk framework, the policy and the appetites, and just having that board involvement in the language that was being used was just, all I would say is don't underestimate the value that has then brought subsequent conversations, and that just true understanding and ownership that's brought into the board meetings, I think, is just something not to be dismissed. The second piece of work undertaken earlier this year, again with Andy's support, we ran a session for our board and executive team outside of a board meeting, specifically looking at risk, but looking at the operational environment at the time, how it impacted on our current risks, how we thought, you know, what we thought emerging risks may or may not be. And the session also explored how individuals interpret risk and understand risk, and just really what they're, you know, where they're coming from. So for me, I really like everything in pictures. That doesn't necessarily work for the majority of people. But the session explored absolutely everything from sort of, you know, what the risk should be, what the mitigations would be, but linking it then with the business plan, with the budget, with the stress testing, with those scenarios, and really asking boards to make a decision about kind of like, well, what would you do? You know, what are the mitigations? What are the controls that you put in place at particular points? And I think, you know, that's one of the key things that we've done. But in all honesty, I think making risk owned by the board, it's just an ongoing piece of work. You know, you have to think that they're doing their day job, and then that they're coming and they're putting a board hat on. You know, so it's just how you make it sort of as in front of them and as accessible as possible.
Yeah, no, thanks, Megan. Just one last specific question around kind of board and board tenure in particular, because I think just for the benefit of viewers who are not in England or not representing English organisations here, in England, the code of governance for the NHF, which most organisations are adopting, and there's a regulatory expectation around that, is a maximum 6-year tenure on the board. So there's quite a frequent turnover of board members in English organisations, and I think this issue of how tough it is to be a board member is probably driving a level of churn, if you want, in board members generally. So it's not, whilst I'm going to ask Megan about the 6-year rule, I think the general point about churn in board members is an important one across the board. So how is that affecting you in terms of how's recruitment going, succession planning, learning and development, all those kind of issues that must drop out of that?
That is a good question. I might get myself into trouble, which I hope I really don't. I am fully supportive of the 6-year rule in regards to making sure that you keep boards fresh and you're ensuring that level of churn to make sure you've got an increased diversity of membership. But I do think that it is impacting, and it's certainly making succession planning for me tricky, I'm not going to lie. And I think it does make it difficult to have the right emphasis when you've got people coming in and leaving so quickly, to kind of go, how do you really put the right emphasis on induction? How do you put the right emphasis on learning and development, and make sure that you're sort of getting people up to speed? And I think at the point that people have previously been settled and might have taken a chair position, they're now leaving. So you're possibly looking for a chair much earlier than you would have been. And I think that does influence on the level of stability. And I think with the departure of people earlier, that's impacting on induction, because I think you learn by osmosis a little bit as a board member coming into an organisation, and I think, you know, we're losing skills quite quickly. So I think it's impacting on those things. I mean, again, governance hat on and all of that, I think, you know, the policies have always been there, or should always have been there, to make sure you've got your appraisals, you've got your effectiveness surveys, you've got skills and competency assessments, you've got recruitment approaches, you've got all of these things in place. But I think there's a greater emphasis on how those are done effectively. And I think that's there's things there that are sort of causing questions. I think going back to what you said about recruitment, we last recruited in May this year for 2 positions, and we got 2 really good board members. The pool of candidates, possibly smaller than we were maybe hoping, considering they were sort of quite generic housing operations and housing finance. We would possibly have hoped for a few more people to have applied than we did. But we got 2 candidates. I don't need to recruit again till May. I'm already worried just because of the things I'm hearing, but actually until I hit May, I can't answer the question as to sort of the real impact that we're possibly seeing as to how it's affecting recruitment. I'm just trying to think, but yeah, I think there is this increased level of replenishment for the core skills and the chair abilities that just does keep coming back to my mind. And then it's how that impacts on the relationships again. And this is where I just always keep coming back to, you've got this level of change that you're managing. But, and I will say, all of this said, I attended so many sessions on the Code of Governance when this was sort of brought in, and there are many organisations out there who brought in the 6-year rule prior to the Code of Governance, and it absolutely has worked for them. I might sit here, and I'm very happy to sit here and eat my words in the future if it absolutely works. But I do think that there is an underlying impact of stability, and that does cause me some concern, and I do have some reservations, but we shall have to wait and see how it pans out.
Okay, great. Thank you, Megan. And thank you all. That's kind of all my questions for them all. I'm just going to briefly we've heard from all of the panelists right now, so just going to ask one kind of last question that we're putting up for everybody viewing to answer, which again is, before we close, can we have a view on what will cost saving effectively be? Is that the thing that comes out of the #1 priority from all of this, is controlling our costs in this operating model? Do you think that's going to be that your current your priority as an organisation during 2023? While you're answering that, I know there was one question in the Q&A which Andy gave a written answer to the person to, but I just wonder, Andy, just going to put you on the spot here, just about this issue about where we think inflation rates and interest rates might go in the next few years. I know you put quite a detailed answer up there, but I just wonder, I think that's something that a lot of people might be interested in.
Yeah, the CPI inflation is expected to be peaking round about now. So the 11.1 we've got is expected to be the peak. It could have been quite a bit higher than that had the energy price guarantee not been brought forward. And going forward, it's predicted to be about 9.1 later this year, and 7.4 in 2023. After that, falling over the next couple of years. So beyond 2027, forecasts are coming quite a bit further down than that. In terms of bank rate, we're now at 3%. It's expected to sort of fall back to just over 2% over the next 3 years. Obviously, circumstances at the time will have some impact on those projections, but those are our views based on Bank of England projections at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the difficulty is, though, they are the best projections we can use, but is that the volatility of the situation, and I mean, in terms of inflation, not least of what may or may not happen in Ukraine, is still meaning. I mean, the Bank of England was predicting that prior to the Ukraine war, the Bank of England was predicting that inflation would peak at 4%. So it just shows how world events happening, can just tear up those kind of predictions, and something we need to think about. Can I just go to my colleague? Did we get the result from that question? So pretty interestingly, a pretty even split there between people about thinking that cost control is going to be the #1 priority. I mean, clearly, I suspect it's going to be a priority for everybody. But some of you may have other things that you consider that are going to be on top of that. But I'd like to say thank you to all our panelists for your contributions, to Rebecca, Megan, Sarah and Andy. It's been brilliant. And thank you out there, all of you out there in the virtual world, if you want to join us. The webinar was recorded, and so we will be making that available, and we'll send you a link and a follow-up email with some information coming out of this as well, some kind of summary of the discussion. So I hope you found that enjoyable. Thank you all, and have a good weekend.